At 10 a.m., on the Strand, London, the doors didn't just open for a trial, they opened for a reckoning. Today is Friday, the 23rd of January 2026, Asia, Bangkok time. And the story that's been simmering for years has now spilled onto the marble floors of the Royal Courts of Justice, Strand, WC2A, the kind of building that doesn't care who your father is, who your mother was, or how famous your pain has become. This week, Prince Harry stepped back into that courthouse not as the cheeky spare of old headlines, but as a claimant in a high-stakes civil trial that was formally fixed to begin on Monday, January 19, 2026. A trial expected to run for weeks and threaten the foundations of one of Britain's most powerful news machines. On paper, it's titled like any other case, Lawrence, Sussex, and others v. Associated Newspapers Limited. In reality, it reads like a collision between celebrity, monarchy, and the press, with the Duke of Sussex sharing a courtroom orbit with names like Elton John and David Furnish, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, and Sir Simon Hughes. 7 high-profile claimants, 1 publisher, Associated Newspapers, home of the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. Their allegation is blunt. That unlawful information gathering, the dark arts of a previous era, didn't just happen somewhere in Fleet Street history, but may have been part of a broader culture. Think the kind of claims that instantly make newsroom lawyers sit up straighter: voicemail interception, blagging, surveillance, private investigators. Associated Newspapers denies wrongdoing and argues the stories came from legitimate sources. And then there's Harry, the most emotionally charged figure in the room, and also the most politically radioactive. Because Harry isn't only suing a newspaper, he's forcing a public replay of a question the palace hates more than any tabloid headline. What did the institution know? When did it know it? And why was silence ever treated as strategy? On Tuesday, January 20, Reuters reported Harry's lawyer telling the court that Harry had faced a sustained campaign of attacks for daring to challenge the Mail, a framing designed to make this look like a lone figure standing up to a media empire. But in the background, the legal reality is colder. This is a civil case where credibility, records, and probability matter more than outrage. Now here's where the documentary drama tightens. As the case got underway, the optics around Harry didn't look like a man arriving to settle. They looked like a man arriving to fight. And the moment he walked into the Royal Courts of Justice, the war framing snapped into place, not only because of the claim itself, but because of who is perceived to be in the blast radius. The royal press ecosystem, the rotating cast of correspondence, contacts, and informal channels that, for decades, has helped the monarchy manage the story of itself. That's the wedge Harry keeps driving, and it's why this case is being watched, like a referendum on modern royal life. While Harry was in London, the rest of the monarchy did something it has mastered for generations. It kept moving. Court circular entries show King Charles III carrying out official engagements on January 21, including an event at Lancaster House and a meeting at Clarence House with the President of Indonesia, all within a couple of miles of where Harry's court battle was unfolding. Yet the public record offered no hint of any reunion. Princess Anne was logged at engagements in Edinburgh, methodical as ever, duty, duty, duty. And Prince William, on January 22, was photographed and scheduled in Bristol, spotlighting Earth-shot-linked innovation, a deliberate contrast. The heir building the future, while the spare litigates the past. No statements, no on-camera comments, no public gestures, just a schedule that says, without saying, we are not part of this. And that silence matters because it shapes how this case will feel to the public. Harry frames it as principle, privacy, dignity, accountability, but the palace's posture suggests something else. Containment. Keep the institution above the splash zone. Let the courts handle the courts. Let the cameras find someone else. Except, the cameras won't, because sources of tension are already stacking up. The Guardian warned ahead of proceedings that claimants would need to persuade the judge, Mr. Justice Nicklin, that their evidence is reliable. And if this case becomes a fight about reliability, then every hesitation, every contradiction, every sideways detail will be treated like a crack in the wall. Which brings us to the question that turns day one into a ticking clock. If Harry is here to expose a system, what happens if the system starts exposing him? Because the next twist waiting in the wings isn't about a headline or a leaked photo. It's about an identity, a name that sounds like a joke, until it isn't. Mr. Mischief. And that is where the courtroom stops feeling like a trial and starts feeling like a trap. In Court 73, one silly little name landed like a grenade, Mr. Mischief. By Tuesday, the 20th of January 2026, the atmosphere inside the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand had shifted from headline theater to something sharper. The kind of tension you only get when a witness realizes the questions aren't about feelings anymore, they're about facts, timestamps, and receipts. Outside, cameras clicked. Inside, the air had that stale, overheated courtroom stillness, the hum of laptops, the rustle of bundles, the low cough of people pretending not to stare at a prince on the stand. And then the defense did what good litigators do. They stopped talking about the bigger war and started drilling into the smaller cracks. Harry had arrived thinking the case would unfold on a predictable schedule, but the court timetable had been tightened, submissions compressed, and his testimony pulled forward. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't even dramatic on paper, but it changed the rhythm, and in trials like this, rhythm is everything. When he took the stand, he looked like a man trying to hold two versions of himself in the same body, the public crusader and the private person who hates being watched. The judge, Mr. Justice Nicklin, sat with the calm patience of someone who's seen every kind of performance. His expression didn't rise to meet the emotion. It measured it, and the barrister for the publisher, Associated Newspapers, began with the tone that makes witnesses nervous, polite, clipped, and relentless. Here's the kind of exchange that can happen in moments like this, not a transcript, but a plausible reconstruction of the pressure points described in your source material. Counsel. ANL. The court will appreciate, Prince Harry, that my job is to put allegations to you, Harry, and I'm telling you, it's disgusting to sit here and hear them claim I don't have a right to privacy. Judge Nicklin. Prince Harry, you don't need to argue the case from the witness box. You may answer the question. Your counsel will argue the case. It's the kind of judicial correction that sounds gentle until you hear it a second time. Then a third. Because Harry didn't just answer, he pushed back, he editorialized. He tried to color the frame. And the judge, according to the tone your transcript implies, kept pulling him back to the rails. Judge, you can say, I don't accept that, or I don't know. But you must not make submissions. Lines. Harry, tight jaw. With respect, my lord, I've had bad experiences with this process. Judge, I am intent on you not having a bad experience with me, but I must ask you these questions. That's the moment the courtroom understands what kind of day it's going to be. Then came the hook. The defense had been saving the detail so oddly specific, it feels like it must have come from somewhere. Mr. Mischief. Named Ineve. A name that sounds like a tabloid punchline, until it's attached to a question about private messages and contact with journalists. The defense line, as framed in your material, was essentially this: that there had been communications with a journalist via a Facebook persona, and that Harry's denial would go to credibility. In a trial, credibility is oxygen. Lose it, and everything else collapses. So imagine the pressure of this moment. Counsel, I'm going to suggest to you that you used a Facebook account under the name Mr. Mischief. Harry, no, I never used that name. Counsel, you never used it to contact journalists? Harry, no idea who you're talking about. The room doesn't gasp. Courtrooms rarely gasp. They just lean in. Because the defense doesn't ask a question like that unless they believe they can support it later with a message chain, a record, a device log, something. Even the hint of "we have receipts" is enough to rattle the most confident witness. And in your story world, that's exactly the vibe. The allegation drops out of nowhere. The denial comes fast, and suddenly the case stops being about what the press did and starts flirting with a second storyline. What if the witness is not as consistent as he wants to appear? From there, the questioning pivots into a second trap, the one that always kills celebrities in court: memory. Harry says he doesn't recall certain calls. He doesn't recall a relationship being warm. He rejects the idea that sources can be legitimate without being illegal. He frames it as a system designed to destroy, and the defense keeps returning to the simplest alternative explanation, the one that doesn't require hacking, spying, or private investigators. People talk, friends talk, staff talk, social circles leak, which sets up exchanges like, "Counsel, isn't it possible, Prince Harry, that information came from acquaintances?" Harry, my social circles were not leaky. The godded from the flash to 4. Counsel, not leaky? Harry, I want to make that absolutely clear. That's strong language, absolute language, the kind that becomes dangerous if even one contradictory fact appears later. By the lunch break, the temperature changes, the edges soften, The witness steadies. But the damage of the morning, the combative posture, the judge's repeated corrections, the sudden Mr. Mischief allegation has already seeded a narrative the cameras outside can digest in one line. Harry argued with the judge. Harry contradicted himself. Harry looked rattled. And now, the second part of the trap closes, because the court's attention drifts toward the one area where the defense can't shrug and say, "Friends leaked it." Flight details. Seat numbers. Private investigator emails. If Mr. Mischief is the credibility spark, the flight evidence is the gasoline. Seat 16A. In most lives, it's a forgettable detail, just a number printed on a boarding pass. In Court 73 at the Royal Courts of Justice, it landed like forensic evidence, the kind that makes even seasoned reporters stop tapping their keyboards for a second. Because when a privacy case turns into a fight about how information was obtained, nothing beats specificity, not outrage, not speeches, not even a prince's pain. Specificity. The claimant's case fronted, in the public imagination, by Prince Harry, had been building toward one central point: that this wasn't ordinary journalism, it was alleged unlawful information gathering dressed up as sources and friends. And then, in the bundles of disclosure and the day's courtroom narrative, a figure emerged like a recurring shadow, a private investigator, the kind of name that sounds almost fictional until it's typed into an email chain: Mike Bear. The allegation, as framed in court reporting, and the kind of commentary you've been collecting, was stark. That information about Chelsea Davies' flight in 2007, including seat number and travel timing, had been obtained via a private investigator. That isn't gossip, that's logistics. It's the sort of detail that, if true, doesn't come from a friend at a party. You could feel the room recalibrate the moment it was mentioned. Even in a civil court, where the judge isn't asked to decide beyond reasonable doubt, but rather on the balance of probabilities, there's an instinctive hierarchy of evidence. I felt is soft. I assume is weaker. But seat 16A? That's hard-edged. Harry, on the stand, had already spent hours describing what this world did to him, how it made him paranoid, how it poisoned relationships, how it turned love into a security operation. But when the flight detail surfaced, the story stopped being psychological and became mechanical. And mechanical is where newspapers can bleed. Because this wasn't simply an accusation aimed at the Mail. It was aimed at a person the public can picture. Rebecca English, a senior royal journalist, a familiar face to audiences who watch royal coverage not as news, but as a daily ritual. The drama here wasn't subtle. If the court accepts that unlawful methods were used, then the credibility of an entire royal news pipeline starts to wobble. In the theater of modern monarchy, the royal correspondent isn't just a writer. They're a translator between palace and public. A bridge, a gatekeeper. Which is why, in the story being told by Harry's side, targeting the figurehead becomes symbolic. This is not only about what happened in the 2000s, this is about whether the royal press machine has ever truly cleaned itself. You can almost hear how this would be put in court, with the polite brutality of a barrister who knows the power of a single sentence. Counsel, I'm going to suggest to you that these details could not reasonably have been obtained by lawful means. He's haven't honest in this. Witness defensive. I don't accept that. Counsel, seat number, flight time, and a proposal to place someone beside her. Where does that come from, if not unlawful access? Harry, in your source material, keeps reaching for the same moral baseline, that privacy isn't a privilege, it's a right, and that the press treated his life like open season. What makes this segment so combustible is that it doesn't require the judge to sympathize. It only requires the judge to believe the obvious, that a stranger cannot casually pluck such details out of thin air. But there's another twist that keeps the tension humming. Even if one email looks bad, the defense always has a counterframe ready, one that tries to turn sinister into sloppy and criminal into commonplace. They don't need to prove innocence, they need to sow doubt. Counsel, for A&L, isn't it possible this information came from legitimate channels? Harry, not with those details. Counsel, or from an acquaintance, or from a booking agent, or from someone at the airport. Harry, tight. That's not how this works. The danger for the publisher is that this particular allegation doesn't sound like a rumor passed around a nightclub. It sounds like a system. And systems are what judges notice when they're weighing probabilities. But the danger for Harry is different. Every time he tries to widen the story into a crusade, every time he insists the entire press culture is rotten, the defense can point to the weaker claims and say he is piling inference upon inference. They only need to show that, Some stories could have come from ordinary sourcing to make him look like someone who sees hacking everywhere. That's why the flight evidence matters so much. It's the cleanest line in the mud. Outside court, the monarchy did what it always does when scandal hovers. It projected routine. King Charles stayed visible in official settings. William remained planted in public duty. Anne kept her diary as if nothing in Court 73 mattered at all. No quotes, no public sympathy, no rebuttal, just the quiet message of continuity. And that silence, too, becomes part of the story. Because Harry's presence in London reads like confrontation, while the institution's response reads like containment. If Harry is trying to prove the system harmed him, the system is trying to prove it can outlast him. Still, the courtroom doesn't run on symbolism, it runs on documents. And that is why one seat, number 16A, hung in the air longer than it should have. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific, because it felt like a thread. And everyone in that room understood the same thing at once. If the judge pulls that thread and it doesn't snap, something much bigger than Harry could unravel. The strangest thing about Harry's courtroom crusade is that it keeps circling back to the same enemy. Not a newspaper, not even a palace, but a calendar. London has a way of reminding you where you stand. Walk out of the royal courts of justice onto the Strand, and you're surrounded by monuments, deadlines, and history that doesn't bend for anyone. And in January 2026, that history is whispering something Harry already learned the hard way. In British litigation, timing can be lethal. To understand why this new Daily Mail trial feels like a pressure cooker, you have to rewind to the case that turned time into Harry's most expensive opponent. In the long-running fight against Newsgroup Newspapers, NGN, Rupert Murdoch's UK newspaper arm, Harry pushed claims tied to alleged wrongdoing, stretching back years. But the legal battleground kept narrowing toward a brutal procedural reality. Limitation periods, whether he acted promptly, and whether exceptions applied. In the NGN litigation, court documents and later legal commentary repeatedly flagged how central delay and amendments became, with judges scrutinizing how and when allegations were pleaded. Then came the twist that still stings in royal circles, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quietly devastating: Prince William. In April 2023, multiple outlets reported on court documents indicating William had secured a very large sum in a private phone hacking settlement in 2020 with NGN. No press conference, no public crusade, no prolonged war. Just a settlement, signed off behind closed doors, the kind of move that ends a problem without feeding it oxygen. The contrast is cinematic, and the courtroom knows it. Because while Harry has tried to litigate as a moral campaign, a rolling referendum on tabloid culture, William's approach reads like old-school royal triage: resolve, contain, move on. It doesn't make William a saint, it makes him strategic. And strategy is the language the institution speaks fluently. That difference became impossible to ignore in January 2025, when Harry's NGN case reached its own dramatic endpoint. On the 22nd of January 2025, Reuters reported that Harry settled with NGN after the company agreed to pay significant damages, issued an apology, and admitted Harry had been the victim of unlawful activity, with additional reporting noting NGN also admitted intrusion into the private life of Princess Diana. Sources familiar with the deal said the total cost was more than £10 million, much of it legal fees. That settlement mattered for two reasons. First, it handed Harry a win he could point to proof, in his framing, that he wasn't paranoid, that unlawful practices weren't just myths from the early 2000s. They were admitted, apologized for, paid for. Second, it reinforced the uncomfortable truth that the biggest victories often happen before the courtroom story reaches its grand finale. NGN settled minutes before trial. William settled years earlier, in silence. The lesson is obvious and cruel. The system rewards the player who knows when to stop. Now fast forward again to this week in London, with the Daily Mail's publisher in the dock and Harry back on the witness stand, dragging the past into fluorescent light. The current trial against Associated Newspapers Limited, ANL, alleges unlawful information gathering across the 1990s to 2010s, and Reuters and the Associated Press have both detailed how intensely personal the claimants say the intrusions were, from alleged bugging to medical information and private communications. But the ghosts of past battles hover in the courtroom air. Defense lawyers probe, why now? What did you know then? What can you prove today? Not because they're interested in trauma, but because they're looking for the same weak point that has haunted these cases for years. Delay, inference, and evidential gaps. And outside the court, the monarchy's choreography keeps playing like a silent rebuttal. The court circular shows King Charles III carrying out official engagements in London in the same week, including at Lancaster House and Clarence House, while Harry fought inside a courtroom only a short distance away. William's diary kept moving. Anne's kept moving. The message remains the same. Duty continues. The institution does not flinch, which leaves Harry in the most precarious position of all, trying to prove a system is corrupt, while the system demonstrates, in real time, that it can outlast him. And in a civil trial decided on probability, not applause, the question isn't whether Harry feels wronged. It's whether the judge believes the evidence, and whether Harry's own history with the calendar becomes the story that swallows everything else. The bitter irony is that while Harry fights for privacy in one courtroom, he's still losing the right to feel safe in the country outside it. For Harry, the Daily Mail trial on the Strand is only half the war. The other half lives in a separate, colder file: security. Not headlines, not reputations, protection. The kind that decides whether he can land at Heathrow and move through London without turning every street corner into a risk calculation. That battle already delivered a defining blow on the 2nd of May 2025, when the Court of Appeal dismissed his challenge against the Home Office decision that he would not automatically receive the same publicly funded police protection he had as a working royal. The court backed the framework that his security would be handled on a case-by-case basis through the government's process, not by personal demand or royal status. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was bureaucratic reality delivered like a stamp on a document. And if you want to understand what that means inside Harry's head, picture this. It's late January 2026. He's back in London again, facing questions about Mr. Mischief, sources, and flight logs. Yet the deeper fear isn't what's being said in Court 73. It's what might happen when he walks back outside. That's why, in the background of every courtroom exchange, you can almost hear the conversation that never happens aloud, but feels inevitable. Harry, quiet, controlled. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for safety. Government position flat, procedural. You will be assessed based on threat and circumstance, as determined by the relevant committee. Harry, tightening. I used to be protected because I was a target. The system. You are no longer a working royal. B2040 Nez. The story becomes less about law and more about identity, because security is the last remaining thread connecting him to the old role he walked away from. And that thread is fraying. In a narrative sense, it also explains why this January 2026 court week feels so combustible. The Daily Mail case is about what happened in the past, what journalists did, what private investigators allegedly accessed, what stories were built from what sources. The security case is about the future. What kind of life Harry can realistically build if returning to Britain feels logistically and emotionally unsafe. So, when Harry stands in the witness box and says his wife's life was made an absolute misery, it doesn't land as a single complaint. It lands as part of a wider argument. I can't go home. Not really. And the palace response? It isn't a statement. It's a schedule. The court circular for January 21-22, 2026 paints a picture of a monarchy operating like a machine that refuses to show strain. King Charles III is logged at formal engagements in London Lancaster House, Clarence House duties that signal continuity and authority, just miles from the Strand. Princess Anne is on record fulfilling obligations with her usual steel. Prince William is working away from London visits and public-facing work that keep the heir's focus on the future, not the feud. And Catherine, notably, is not presenting a competing headline. Her absence from the public diary reads like the most modern royal tactic of all: strategic quiet. No public sympathy, no public criticism, just the message the institution has always preferred: we do not feed the fire. And that silence is not neutral. It becomes a kind of counter-narration, especially because Harry's legal war inevitably scrapes against royal optics. If Harry is seen as dragging the monarchy into court by implication, talking about the institution, never complain, never explain, and how difficult it was to push back, then the palace's refusal to engage becomes, to many observers, a statement in itself: we are not on trial. But Harry's supporters will read the same silence as abandonment. If you were truly protecting him, why is he here alone? That's the crisis point, the documentary tension line. Two competing stories running at once. One says Harry is fighting for accountability. The other says he is trapped in a loop, still litigating the past, while the future closes doors. And the most brutal thing is this: The system doesn't need to win to outlast him. Because every trip back to London becomes more complicated. Every public appearance becomes more debated. Every new case becomes another point where credibility and cost grind against time. In Britain, legal battles are rarely just about the verdict. They are about exhaustion, financial, emotional, reputational. So when Harry leaves court at the end of a day like this, he isn't just walking away from questions about emails or aliases. He's walking back into a country that by law, by process, by palace posture, keeps reminding him that the old guarantees no longer apply. And once a person realizes that, the only question left isn't whether they keep fighting. It's what they do when fighting no longer leads home. In the end, that's what makes this whole saga so combustible. It doesn't hinge on one dramatic speech, or even one gotcha exchange in Court 73. It hinges on something quieter. One judge, one probability test, and one or two stories that could tip the scale. Because this is a civil trial, no jury, no applause meter. Just Mr. Justice Nicklin, weighing whether, on the balance of probabilities, any of the 14 disputed articles were built from unlawfully gathered information. If he believes even a narrow slice, say, the flight detail thread, Harry doesn't need a sweeping victory to trigger real consequences. He only needs a crack big enough for daylight to get in. And that is why the Seat 16A story matters so much. Not because it's the most emotional, but because it's the most mechanical. Emotional narratives are easy to dismiss as a lifestyle complaint. Logistics, flight times, seat numbers, payment trails are harder to hand-wave away as friends talking. They're the kind of detail that turns a royal media debate into an evidence problem. But there's a second explosion already baked into the case, regardless of the verdict: the collateral damage. The moment Harry stepped into the witness box, he dragged the past into the present. Chelsea, Cressida, Natalie, names he insists are proof of what the press did to his private life, but names that also reopen old chapters in public. For his critics, it looks like obsession. For his supporters, it looks like unfinished business. Either way, it keeps Harry locked in the rearview mirror. Meanwhile, the palace continues its most disciplined response: none at all. Charles remains on duty. William stays forward-facing. Anne keeps her steel-trap schedule. Catherine's public quiet reads like strategy, not absence. They don't rebut him, they outlast him. And that contrast, one side fighting loudly in court, the other side moving silently through official life, creates its own narrative gravity. In modern royal drama, silence isn't emptiness, it's a message. So where does that leave us? Here on Friday, the 23rd of January, 2026. It leaves Harry in a high-wire moment. If he wins narrowly, he may claim vindication, but at the cost of exposing more of his life to prove the point. If he loses, the defense narrative hardens, inference piled on inference, memory gaps, and an alias, Mr. Mischief, that becomes shorthand for doubt. And either way, the broader war doesn't end at the Strand, because the security battle already changed the rules of his return, and every London appearance now carries the shadow of that the 2nd of May 2025 appellate defeat. In other words, the court case may deliver a ruling, but it won't deliver closure. Not for Harry, not for the Mail, and certainly not for a monarchy that has mastered the art of surviving storms by refusing to acknowledge the thunder. Thank you for watching, and if you want the next briefing the moment it drops, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and tell me in the comments. Is Harry fighting for justice, or fighting to rewrite his legacy? Because the verdict may not be in yet, but the fallout is already moving.